And I'll explain to you what that's about in a little bit. So up here, anyone recognize this face? Edward R. Murrow, right? Related to the topic, today's journalism. What is it? What are the standards? What is the purpose? And more. Okay? So first we want to establish, you know, where we are, what it is we're talking about, right? So what precisely are we talking about? I.e., let's define what it is. And I thought first I would start with where's my journalist, Barb Walters, right over here, the person who recruited me to Torch. Okay, you got a microphone? Hi, yeah, they're there. So,
I'm very happy that I recruited Ken.
oh, thanks. So, Barb, I want you to think about when did you start in journalism as a profession after college?
Late
Late, okay.
because first I was a teacher, um, and then we went to Africa. First, I was a teacher in California, and then I was a teacher in Africa.
Okay.
And then when I came back from Africa, I was so grateful to be in a democracy that I got real interested in local government, city councils, planning commissions, townships. So I started stringing for the Gazette while also teaching. And then eventually, the Gazette hired me full time in 1980. So,
1980, the year I graduated college. Okay,
and
good.
yes, a good year.
So now let me
And
ask you the
then I
question.
retired in 2025 after full time there.
Good. So there's
No, I'm sorry,
45.
2005.
Oh,
I knew I shouldn't have had
2005.
that second wine.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to ask you two questions. Hang on to the microphone.
Oh
Okay.
dear.
So you started in 1980, the year that I graduated college and went into the Navy. Okay.
Okay.
Back then, put your mind back then. How would you define journalism back then?
Journalism for our paper, our local paper, was the paper record. I started out my career covering the road commission, every township commission meeting, and I revered those very mundane, um, to some people. But that's, and other people above me did city commission, county commission, and school board. That was our pride and joy when there were national, state um, elections. We, and as Dale Chugers know, we went door to door with them. Um,
Okay. So your
on both.
focus was on government and how you could now why was your focus on government? Did it relate to that's the information you wanted to provide your readers?
I think the information we did have, by the way, feature stories, but not so much. I think that we just saw that as our role, not
Okay.
that we felt like you should have this, but that's
The role that
how
you played.
that was our role.
Okay. So and the format was a form of a traditional newspaper, is that correct?
It was.
Okay. So now, so what I did a little research in preparation for this. And this is what we're doing, defining journalism, right? So think about what Barb just said and the conversation we just talked about. So I looked up an older definition of journalism in the Britannica, which said the reportage of events in printed form, specifically newspapers, and ostensibly, we can tell from at least Barb's focus in her career in journalism was on government proceedings. Right?
Can I just interrupt
Sure.
just slightly? I would have to add that, for example, when the Gilmore was announced, that was enormous, enormous, enormous stuff. We put a lot of emphasis on the arts, especially starting in the 90s. And we put out special sections about the Gilmore every single review. Every concert was reviewed. Huge preview stories about every artist that really was also a very significant portion of our effort and resources.
Okay, so you reached beyond the government proceedings into other areas that the arts, like you say, so that serves a little different purpose, doesn't it, than reporting on government
No,
proceedings?
I think what we were supposed to do was reflect the community,
Okay,
and the government reflected the community, but so did the Gilmore. So did what if the First Presbyterian Church was celebrating its 100th birthday. Um, we tried to reflect, I think, what the community was.
okay, so that's on your level of journalism in Kalamazoo. Your perspective is that's what your focus was. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So but here we're looking at we're expanding our viewpoint to a little broader than Kalamazoo, but that is a legitimate aspect of journalism in a given local community. One thing I wanted to then look at is journalism changed not just in terms of purpose, but in the way it's done, how it's now in a more modern context today defined. Okay, and now a more modern, oh, and again, another face that you might recognize. Anyone recognize him? David Brinkley. Yeah, that's one of my favorite news reporters actually from years ago. The collection, preparation, and distribution of news and related commentary and feature materials through such print and electronic media as newspapers, magazines, books, blogs, webcasts, social networking, and social media sites, and email, as well as through radio, motion pictures, and television. We see something has changed. Journalism has changed in form and expanded greatly, right? So a Cambridge definition then that I looked up, was the work of collecting, writing, and publishing news stories in articles in newspapers and magazines or broadcasting them on the radio or television. So I would say these last two definitions are probably traditionally what we would think of as journalism. So now I'm going to take us through about a 5-minute history of where did journalism come from? And then eventually here, shortly after that, we're going to get to much more involvement in the discussion. There's probably most people's favorite, Walter Cronkite. I remember in the days of Lassie and Walt Disney, you know, listening to Walter Cronkite as my parents led me off to take a bath to go to bed then. You know. Earliest known journalism product, when I looked this up in several places, is a news sheet circulated in ancient Rome called the Acta Diurna. Not sure if I pronounced that right. Said to date from before 59 BCE. So that is the start, the historical beginning, as best as I could find, of journalism. So here's kind of a dateline of when, where, and what kind of format did journalism take at that time. So we begin with the Acta Diurna that we mentioned before in Rome. And then in China, the Tang dynasty is the kind of the time period of 618 to 907 CE. A court circular called a bao, or a report, which was a report to government officials, took various forms. I've got some photographs of these in another slide coming up. And that form lasted all the way until 1911, just before World War I, and the demise of what was called the King or Queen, I'm not sure I can pronounce that right, dynasty. And then in Europe, we see in 1609, in German cities and Antwerp, the first regularly published newspapers, what we would consider the beginnings of what we recognize as journalism. And then not long after that, in London, England, the first English newspaper called the Weekly News, which lasted about 20 years. And then in 1702, we have in London the Daily Courant published, which was one of the first daily newspapers. Okay? So previous newspapers would maybe be only published once a week or once a month, something like that. This is what these various forms look like. So here's the Acta Diurna from ancient Rome. Here's a copy of the Weekly News from London. Here's one of those bows from China. And then the Daily Courant from London, first daily newspaper. And then the first multi-page newspaper published in Britain in September 25th, 1690, in British colonial America, was intended to be published monthly. Okay, but it got one issue. It didn't last long, and there's a reason that happened. And there is a copy in existence of that one issue that is preserved in the London Public Record Office. And the problem was it had an account of a battle waged by General Fitzjohn Winthrop during the French and Indian Wars, and the article covered the brutal treatment of the French POWs, which then angered the colonial government, so they shut the paper down. They didn't like what they said. And then we have various news sheets. This is, of course, representing the American Revolution. The image there of George Washington and the flag. The start of the revolution. I'm not sure what that date, back to that. When was that's Stamp Act, that's it, thanks. Okay. And news sheets and publications begin to proliferate, often anonymous, right? In 1900, we have the term coined muckraker journalism by Teddy Roosevelt, no less, who we had a presentation on earlier this year, which has a couple of meanings associated. One is when it was established, digging for the facts. In other words, digging deep, doing your research, and going in depth into a story. Or, I think as Roosevelt referred to it, it's a pejorative for sensationalizing things, because there were articles written that he didn't appreciate. Okay, and so the idea that sensationalizing something to blow something up and based on an agenda or a specific purpose, rather than reporting facts and allowing the reader to reach their own conclusions about listing those facts. It wasn't until 1908 that we have the first formal journalism schools established in the United States at Missouri and Columbia. Okay, so there's a time frame there for when did we start to establish this as a formal area academically for people to go into formal study and instruction on how to do this. Okay, and then in the 1920s, of course, we have the flapper over there representing that time period, that the concept of objectivity, really, or neutrality became norms in US journalism. Okay, so if you go back and you read some of the publications from either the Revolutionary era, et cetera, up through the Civil War, it's not that there was any consistent attitude about maintaining objectivity on an issue. Okay, that was not a norm and not even considered to be something to pursue. Now, there's some argument as to, well, why was there a movement towards the idea of publishing with an objective, taking an objective position, presenting facts, and allowing the reader to arrive at their own conclusion. And there's perhaps a good business reason behind that, and that is if you take a position on especially a controversial issue that is perhaps 50% of the population looks at it one way and 50% looks at the other way, If you take the position on one side, guess who you've just, cut out as your likely reader? Half the population. So it's maybe simply because of good business thinking that this concept of neutrality or objectivism in journalism took hold. And that's actually a very recent 1920s development. And then in the 1950s, so the era of Truman finishing up as president and Eisenhower, who was president when I was born, first appears as a major across universities. Okay. So we had the establishment at Columbia, Missouri years earlier, but not really a major common across multiple universities for quite a few years afterwards. So journalism as a uh, professional and academically backed pursuit was really pretty recent during our lifetime. So now, we can turn that off now, Andy. Who do you suppose? Think about the discussion I had with Barbara and where that discussion seemed to center up, even in a local area like Kalamazoo. Who would you say defines the purpose of journalism? Just flag me. The reader. Who's the reader? There we are. The market, the people, right? Okay. So, yes. Okay, maybe on a level of influence, but um, hopefully we as a population, the consumers, that's what we are, right? We are consumers of journalism. Hopefully we have influence that's going to define uh, that purpose, okay? And what do we want as consumers? What do we want? What to you makes journalism as a product valuable? Just the facts. To do what? Inform why? Why is journalism in effect part of the First Amendment? What's the truth? Well, really, is there an absolute truth? Who here can tell me an absolute truth? So I think of the truth in terms of the pursuit of the truth, but I may not ever reach it. If you're familiar with calculus, the predecessor to calculus is limit theory, which essentially is slicing the distance from something thinner and thinner, but we may never get to that final thing, the truth. Yeah. There we go. That relates to what Barbara was talking about, right? Facts that relate in, again, why is it in the First Amendment? Is it in there because we want the comic strip section of the newspaper to be funny? Is it in there because we want a good review of an opera? That's all fine, but was that why it was put in the First Amendment? No. It had to do with functionality as a voter or as a citizen of the United States, a citizen of Kalamazoo, which the purpose is everything I heard Barbara say was oriented, centered around providing the voters, the citizens of Kalamazoo, with what they needed to make. Everybody hear that? So let me repeat it. Yeah, let me repeat it. Yeah, and we should have the microphones out. So what he said was He appreciated my distinction between citizen and voter because we need to understand that as citizens, that carries responsibility with it. Did I get that right? Okay. And not just, hey, I'm going to go vote one day and to heck with anything else, right? Okay. Yes.
Government is not going to censor, just like your first example, that paper got shut down because it did that without the protection of the First Amendment. The, the, the
The government
collection
will
of
shut it down.
the collection of, well, just all you have to do is look at a place like Russia or someplace else where there isn't any freedom to express yourself. And again, people have to be thinking on the one side, but people have to be able to report it on the other hand.
Exactly.
Otherwise, you're basically just you're gonna get fed whatever whoever controls the media wants you to hear.
Exactly. So, yeah, we want a diversity of viewpoints, a diversity of, an analogy would be if I have a complex object and I want to understand the views of that object, what that object is comprised of, will I only get a good view of that by looking from above at that object? Is that me or somebody else?
Somebody else.
Yeah. Okay. So, but rather I need side views, I need an underneath view, I need views from varying perspectives to get at as close as I can, maybe not to the absolute truth, but as close as I can to the truth. So there's a function there. Go ahead.
You seem to be focusing on different views, but which to me I interpret as being people's opinion of things. For me, true journalism is information gathering. You have to go out into the street like Barb did. You
Okay.
have to go seek it
Hang
at
on
the
to that.
source.
Hang on to that for the, because we're about to get there. Okay. So what you're getting at is the value of journalism. What's it good for, and what makes it what you're now pursuing is an attribute of journalism that's needed to be quality journalism. Does that capture it? Yes.
I think there's another element that most of these news sources uh, have advertising. So there's an economic consideration that complicates the matter. Uh, People are persuaded to buy certain things because
Yeah, it's human nature, right? So yeah, some things will grab our attention but above others. So here's what I want you to do at your tables now, because you're already starting, Dan already started going there. So that tells me it's time to go there. Yeah. Great. I have some interesting data on that just from this week. So hang on to that thought and bring it up again later if I don't. At your table, have something to write on that card. I'm going to give you 5 minutes, everybody. At your table, list. So let me write up a little diagram here. So there is an end product, regardless of form, a journalistic product. There is a process that gets it there to the end product. So there is a process of journalism and a product of journalism, which is part of journalism, right? At your tables, what are the attributes that are needed to result in a quality journalistic product, whether those attributes reside in the process or reside and are apparent in the final product. So think about that, discuss it at your tables, and on that card, begin writing the attributes that are necessary for quality journalism to occur. On the blank side, the number side's for later. So on the blank side, The number is for another use. You have 5 minutes. I get to finish my moose. One minute. 10 seconds. Okay. You need another minute. Are you ready? Do you have at least 3 or 4 attributes written down? Anybody not have? Okay, you're supposed to write down several. Okay? Yes, very. Yes. We'll get to that. We'll get to that. That'll be here. Okay. Now, look on the number on the back side of that little card. I put up here a random number generator for me. We have 6 tables. So I numbered them 1 through 6, and my random number generator is pi, 3.141592653589793238446. And then I took the first time that number, a number of a table appeared. So table 3, where are you? Table 3. Is that over here? Okay. Give me your top attribute of quality journalism.
Write anything down?
People don't follow instructions.
We were busy over here. Oh, we're not good.
One attribute.
A business plan, money, capital,
Okay, so
in order to keep it afloat. Right, to
okay,
fund.
so that's your top attribute
I didn't follow
in the
Dale
process
around
of
for
generating quality journalism. Okay. We'll go to another table. We'll come back around. Table 1. Give me your number 1, your best one.
Well, let's
Most
see.
important.
That's okay. We'll say maybe, let's see. We like a variety of sources and the ability to write well about those sources, about the information.
Okay, you're giving me 2. So a variety of sources.
Yeah. And knowledgeable about what you're gathering.
Okay, you said variety of sources along with, I think, something about
Ability to write.
ability to write. So competent writing.
Yes.
Writing competency.
Yeah. And knowledgeable about what they are gathering.
Okay, knowledge related to the topic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
And up by business.
we might come back to you.
Okay.
We got to give the other tables a chance. Table 4. Where's table 4? Table 4 over here. That's okay. Give us some more.
Needs to be verified, fact checked,
Ah, verification.
expose facts.
Yeah.
So
no.
verification of the facts.
Don't read into it.
What else?
Credibility, so that goes with sources.
A variety of sources. That's a little different though than credibility of sources. So how do you determine credibility? Credibility sources. Credible sources. Is that better?
Yeah, credible sources
Credible
sounds
sources.
good.
Credible. Okay.
Jim liked the who, what, when, where. Don't forget that.
Okay, so that should be in the product. Who, what, who,
Just 4.
when,
They said they don't care about why.
where, in the end product. Okay, let's
Just
go on to
4 of them.
table 5. That's good.
Okay.
That's good. Table 5.
Table 5, well, we covered a lot of this, but we did discuss the vetting of the journalists. The journalists should be qualified and their sources should be checked by editors.
Wow.
They should have 2 or 3 sources for anything they are writing about, and that can be checked. So it's not made up.
So oversight by editors, and that sounds, the last part sounds, editors, similar to verification of facts. Okay. Table 2. Where are you? Objectivity. What does that mean? So keep out your personal bias. Rationality. Okay. So distinguish opinion, editorials, from reporting that is at least presenting itself as presenting facts. Okay, that kind of goes with the research and good. So rationality, distinguish opinion from fact. Okay. And last, table 6.
The final product that's important. Your take from whatever.
Okay.
There was a lot done on this area. It was like what Connie said. Don't read into it because the problem isn't what's on the page. The problem is what's up here and how we read it. So there was an experiment, a social experiment that was done like in the 1980s, and they took an article and they a fictional event, and they all agreed that this was non-biased. Everybody in the study, and they took it to the most polarized place on the planet, which was the Middle East, and it was about that. And they gave it to the Israelis to read and the Palestinians to read. And the Palestinians said it was biased in favor of the Israelis. The Israelis said it was biased in favor of the Palestinians. Frank said, what about when someone is accused of sexual harassment? It can be reported as fact. You can vet the journalist, you can use disappearing ink, whatever, but there are two opinions, and you'll walk away with what's on what they think is on the page, not what's on the page. So the final product is not what's on the page, it's what is here in the reader's head.
Okay, so what you're talking about is not an attribute of journalism, you're talking about an attribute of the consumer.
Journalism is there for the consumer. Otherwise, it would be kindling.
Okay. So does journalism exist if the consumer doesn't exist?
Yeah, because the consumer exists.
Well,
but the consumer, no matter what you do out there with the final product, how the consumer reads it is what's important, not what's on the page.
okay, but again, that's an attribute of the consumer, right? And you're right. I mean, I'm not saying that you're wrong. It may or may not, right? It may or may not.
One attribute that kind of supports that comment, and that's that the writing should be succinct. Is it very interesting or fantastically interesting? And the phraseology itself will contribute to how it's read. And
that is totally true.
Yeah.
Because every newspaper article or whatever they come out, say something like something is as high as 20%. And somebody else will say it is as low as 20%. Yeah, just
Right.
20%.
Right.
But
Glass
the
half
reader
full,
still
half empty.
takes it away. The reader still takes it away.
Yep. Yeah.
I think there's an interesting distinction sometimes between opinion and judgment, where opinion can often be understood as at least partly emotional, whereas judgment can be based on objective criteria and appeal more to reason.
Sorry, you're saying that opinion is never no one has the ability to hold out their emotional response in coming up with an opinion, but the same person has an ability to hold out their response, their emotional response in dealing out judgment.
Yeah, I used to make this distinction when I was teaching writing.
Okay.
Especially if it came to something as presumably as subjective as judging a poem or a work of literature. And I would say, well, try to get beyond merely your feeling about something. That's important, but try to get beyond the subjective to this ideal category of the objective. And that would be judgment. Think of a judge in a legal situation. It's an ideal.
Okay. So now let's take a look. We have these attributes that we've listed that we say are elements that we would want resident in either the process of coming up with a journalistic product or in the final product itself. And then Dave added in, there's an attribute of the consumer that we can't, does the journalist control the attitudes and biases of the consumer? No, that's well, potentially they can influence her, right? But all of us start from some spot on whatever spectrum we're talking about in terms of whether it's a scientific viewpoint. When Einstein proposed his theory of relativity, how many classical Newtonian physicists instantly said, yeah, that's it, baby? Zero, right? He was pretty much alone in the universe on what he came up with, which was correct. That's why science is not a process of democracy. It shouldn't be based on democracy because it's not a democratic process, right? So the consumer's own bias, has a considerable influence or, yeah, passion, predilections. Sure. Yeah, that's like the coach. Yeah, that's Lou Holtz versus, the little guy in the classroom writing very quietly and talking in monitor. So, yeah, yeah. Okay, so in the next thing, I want to ask you why is capital important? You brought this up. Why is money important in the process of journalism? Oh, Barb did. Barb brought that. Why is money important?
Money is important because all these other attributes, which we have listed, depend on the
Resource?
personnel,
Yeah.
the resources, from the printing machine to the personnel to the editors, multiple editors. What we have today, as you know, is that when the business model collapsed for the model that we all mostly grew up with, um, into that void came other sources that were funded by everything from dark money to there's a multitude of sources that eroded the trust that Americans have in journalism, which further has further polarized us and made us, as Dave pointed out, see everything from our own silos.
Okay. So capital, definitely that's the equivalent. It's what's behind having the resource.
Yes, because
that's why it's important.
Can pay with the billions of dark money and other
sources, right, that are
dark
competing for our attention.
right, a paper on the other model, the traditional model, cannot compete with that.
Okay.
Because of the technology.
But now I think that leads to the next one. Why is a variety of sources important? Yeah, go ahead.
This is the only business that is covered by the Constitution. So the Constitution supports this business and says that we can put capital into it. And Yeah. And so, and with the variety of sources, do you want us to just continue with what we've got on that, or do you want?
Well, the idea here is, why is that important? Why is a variety of sources important?
And we felt like one thing is there's a variety of interests, but variety of sources also lends credibility to the story, because a reporter might get a tip and they think they've got a hot story and they start, calling and trying to verify it, and they find out there's really no story there at all. So, calling and making sure and verifying, and also having an editor check it.
So this same thing leads to the ability to do this. Variety of sources. And so if you read about the history of spying and the results of espionage and that kind of thing, in the early days of, what was the predecessor of the CIA? It was OSS. They had a rule. You need two, at least, independent sources to verify something is factual before it is considered actionable. That would be a good journalistic practice. Right? So that we have confidence. So this variety of sources leads to the verification of facts. Why is that important? Reliable. And other things, right? We have up here writer confidence slash the writer should be able to generate interest. Why is that important? Yeah, you want somebody to read your product, right? Hold the interest of the reader. That the person generating the product should have some knowledge of what they're writing about. Why is that important? Exactly. Improve the odds that it's going to be accurate. I don't know how many times I have read articles about the nuclear industry and they screw something up big time. And even what most people would recognize as the highest quality traditional publications, whether we're talking about the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, both. Okay? It seems like when a journalist decides to write something technical or about a technical field, variably it gets screwed up. That's been my experience with my industry. Credible sources. Why is that important? Why silenced everybody or something? Come on. Good. There you go. You need to interview, well, not just interview, sometimes it's a matter of, right, somebody's writing something down and they don't write it down right. So show me what you're writing down, right? So on the other side, there's some responsibility to say, hey, before you're going to quote me in this paper, let me see what you just wrote. Let me hold you accountable for reflecting what I supposedly said. Jim put up what, who, when, where as being included in the final product. Is that correct, in a story? Okay. Yeah, Dave.
Most important things we could do is to teach people how to recognize the difference between someone's opinion and fact. How can we need to teach people to recognize bias? And I
Oh,
think that transcends a lot of this other discussion.
okay.
Is
So you
that
want
we
to,
have a bunch of uneducated readers. They don't know the difference between fact and opinion. And so I would like to add that to at least somewhere in this discussion, that is important in making the rest of this flow.
okay, so you want to focus on distinguishing opinion from fact on the part of the consumer. Is that correct? You want to focus in on this particular attribute, which is uh, distinguishing opinion from fact, but you're applying that to the end consumer. Okay?
I'd like to expand on that for a moment. We live in an age of misinformation. We live in an age where the consumer is often can only understand or appreciate short bits of information rather than the longer form that seems to be implied by this discussion.
Okay? So, how do we do that? How do you personally overcome the bias and opinion that's resident or
Who taught? I had a great teacher in 8th grade in Cleveland who taught us 8 red flags of misinformation and and bias, and I can only remember 2 of them. Again, I blame the wine. Thank you.
Okay, well, clue us
Ivanhoe.
in on the 2. Yeah. Well,
Don't I wish? No, but one of them was sweeping generalities. Don't if an article or something sweeping generalities. All Democrats drink rosé. You know, then that should be a red flag. Another is and related name calling. You know,
so pejoratives.
Mexicans are all, you know, are anyway, name calling. Um, and then glittering generalities. And we studied those, but even if we could teach our children to be alert, we teach them about mathematics, we should teach them that about thinking, and I'm very grateful for that.
So I have a question for you. Is today the availability and access to source information more readily available than it was, let's say, 50 years ago, or less readily available? Okay, let me give you an example. You hear a reporter on some news channel talk about a recent Supreme Court ruling. How do you know that reporter reported it accurately? Can look up the ruling. How many people in here have read in the last 3 years at least 10 Supreme Court rulings, including the dissents? Okay, I'm the only one who's read 10 or more. How many have read some? Good. Consider yourselves, above the average, well above the average. In the club, yeah. Okay.
An anomalous population from the standpoint that we are more informed than the average person.
On
And,
what?
and I, as we leave here, if you'll pardon me for my language, because it's the name of the book, I would encourage everybody to read a book called Calling Bullshit, The Art of Skepticism in a Data-Driven World by Bergstrom and West. It is basically it's 16 chapters that represent the 16 lectures of a University of Washington course. The whole course is online, by the way. And it turns out it's the most popular course at the University of Washington campus. And the examples used in the book, it's not for statisticians or scientists, come from many of them come from USA Today and from other journals and sources where the data have been manipulated to present the point of the writer.
Okay. What was the name of the book again?
Calling bullshit. It's pretty easy
Calling
to
Bullshit.
remember. Bergstrom and West, who are the two professors in the mathematics department, in the biology.
I have a feeling if you go on Amazon and just type in calling bullshit under the topic books, it'll come up.
Well, the other thing, Ken, is I think when we talk about news, is that I've often had those kind of discussions. I think at the newspaper, Barbie as well, is that a story that would say that 64 flights successfully landed in Kalamazoo Airport today, or all of the school buses for Comstock Community Schools picked up and delivered all the children. That might be factual, but that's not news. Part of that news that we want to hear are those things that really kind of catch our attention, that have some stimulation in it, that of real interest. So that sparks it. Yes.
Okay, is
Sensation.
this problem, do you think, only, so this is a problem. Are we getting all of the positive attributes that we want in journalism? No, no. Let me read you something. Do you think it's a problem in the scientific world in journals?
Oh, yeah.
So let me read you the topic of a recent one, which made it through peer review. Okay. The conceptual penis as a social construct. The abstract begins this way. Anatomical penises may exist, but as preoperative transgendered women also have anatomical penises, the penis vis-a-vis maleness is an incoherent construct. We argue that the conceptual penis is better understood not as an anatomical organ, but as a social construct isomorphic to performative toxic masculinity. This was, let me tell you, so you are correct, okay? But it was published and peer reviewed. So I want to tell you a couple things. So this was in Cogent Social Sciences, okay? And it was purposefully done on the part of a professor named Peter Boghossian, who did this with another professor, because a few years ago, they detected this was a problem in the science. And they said, I wonder if we can get away with writing total bullshit and getting it published and peer reviewed. And they did. Okay. In the Wall Street Journal just yesterday, let me give you another quick example. Here it is. The article disappeared, of course. So it was, I sent you an email today on this so I can look at my email with the results of this. Sent to Jim. 11,000 retracted scientific papers across 29 journals under one publisher who is now going bankrupt and out of business. And they have existed for over 200 years. Yep. But what it tells you is we don't even have this in the scientific journal world as a reliable set of attributes. Yes.
I just wanted to, when my colleague Jim Coppinger commented, I wanted to say that although Jim and I worked in the same building, our departments were purposely separated. And Jim's job, which he did so well, that to sell advertising and keep us well funded, our advertisers were the driving business model. And really, the car companies and Libens and stuff, they didn't really care how much what we printed. But now that we're in a digital click operated, click run journalism, it's the subscribers, and here's where what you were talking about, Dave. It's the subscribers who their prejudices and so forth, our prejudices, and they drive the content, and I think that's a big problem. Um,
Well,
they drive the content rather than your customers didn't really care that I wrote that the county whatever planning commission or
but you have to
whatever.
sell the papers, right? So you have to appeal to the audience. You have to appeal to the consumer. Do you
No,
not?
no. What I'm saying is that back in my day, we didn't need to appeal so much to the audience because we made tremendous profits. I hate to say how much of off real estate ads. You remember how thick those ads
Oh,
were
okay.
back
Because you
in
kind of
that
had a
day.
monopoly on the advertising.
Yeah, but now that we're click digitally driven,
Right.
then if they think like, well, this area it's mostly Democrat or they're right wing or left wing, our silo is it's creating more polarization.
Yeah.
The switch to a digitally motivated
Yeah. No argument
business
there.
model.
The other thing, but Barbara's right. We had two sides, editorial and advertising. But one of the things I always found amazing with the newspaper is that the newspaper, it was a mathematical formula on any given day that it was 60% advertising, 40% news. So if I had 28 pages of advertising, that is 60% of whatever number of pages. So editorial knew that they had like 18 pages to fill. And then every morning there was an editorial meeting where they were looking at the news coming in. News competed for that space in the newspaper. So the more advertising there was, the more space there was. It was proportional, but it was not driven by the interests of the advertisers. It was more of a mathematical formula.
Okay. So let me kind of wrap this up. Yeah. Sure. Sure.
I think it can be very easily. For me, when I heard that, the fact that that company has gone bankrupt, is an indication to me that the system works because every scientific journal, every article in there is only worth its salt if it's replicable. And what's finding is that everybody's got a bias. The science people putting these together, obviously this journal that published this thing probably had a bias in that direction. But the reality is, if a study isn't replicable, if it can't be independently verified, just like any story you read in any news source can't be verified by actually looking at the facts of what really it is, it's it ultimately is just somebody's opinion framed by their own
And largely is the
whatever
their
title of
bias.
the book, right? Bullshit. So yeah, Jack.
I
Sorry.
think
That
Yeah.
I think it's to be really cynical about this. I could say that uh, the article is the article, and the independent verification is my bias. I mean, uh, I read something, and if I agree with it, I essentially verify it. I mean, in practical terms, I I just have done that. Uh, it takes some real discipline to hold back and say there may be more to this than I thought. A good example I would like to give to you is the chemical industry versus the the people who deal with the ecological issues, pollution and so forth. You can get an article written from the corporate standpoint, the chemical industry standpoint. It sounds like we really need to have this chemical out there. You read from the ecologist, for example, ALAR, the insecticide that was banned. It turned out that the ecologist so overstated that risk that it ruined the whole thing. That product never got started. So I doubt if you can get the whole story from reading either only the ecologist's point of view or only the chemical industry's point of view. You got to have both of them, and you're not going to get them in the same article. Probably, you're certainly not going to get them from the same author.
So that's kind of an extension of the First Amendment, right? We need multiple viewpoints on any issue. So let me try and wrap it up so I don't hold everybody here. A couple of thoughts that I want to leave you with. One is,
I was going to say, one of my favorite journals, it's called the Journal of Irreproducible Results.
Okay.
And it's kind of a fun journal to read. They collect all these articles that really can't be reproduced, and they're like this article you were reading, and make fun of it because it can be easy to get a paper published if you shop around and you're willing to pay to get it published, and people try to get tenure. I know some universities in Michigan, not the top ones, but the lower ones, where the people were publishing articles that they were peer reviewing for their colleagues.
They made a deal. You
They
review
made a deal.
mine, I'll review yours, we'll both get tenure.
Right.
You should
So-
realize, right? Well, most of you should better than me because I don't have a PhD. How do you get tenure? You get published. I think the magic number now is 10. Right? So, a couple things to leave with. When I looked back at this, my personal view on if we proceeded away from a more objective journalistic community from when I was younger towards a more bias. And my perspective was, yes, we have. And then I asked the question, why? And is that unusual? And I think it is unusual in human history and in our history. Then the question becomes, what drove a more objective? Because again, if you go back, right, we went through that little history of journalism. The concept of objectivity and residing in journalism didn't really come into play until the 1920s. Right? If you go back and look at we're talking about broadly, right? I'm sure there are some institutions that did that. Okay. So what happened? So everybody here's a baby boomer, right? Or anybody older? Okay, okay. Some don't want to answer that question. What marked the beginning of the baby boomer generation? What event? World War II. I'm going to list some names. George McGovern, Richard Nixon, Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Bob Dole. Previous war. What do those names all have in common? Not all of them became president. Most of them did. They all served in World War II together. They all defeated the enemy, which was the Nazis, etc. So despite being Republican or Democrat, they had this common bond. We defeated the enemy together. A generation's gone or darn near gone at this point. And those leaders. So to me, perhaps, I don't have definitive proof, but it's an observation that I make historically. Perhaps that event was so uniting in purpose in our country that it brought us together despite certain differences. And now people don't have that. Okay? Yeah. Certainly there are other Yep. But if you go back in like the founding times of the country and look at some of the things that Alexander Hamilton anonymously wrote about his political opponents and vice versa, they said some of the most scurrilous things, as bad as anything you hear today or worse, right? So, okay. But you think we're ever going to get to the point where uniformly we're going to have all these wonderful attributes in journalism? What are the odds that everybody's going to do that uniformly? Sure.
It was required for TV and radio stations to present both sides of every issue, and that was removed in the 1980s, just as we exploded the number of TV stations and radio stations in this country. So they no longer are they required to present both sides and provide equal time. That's number one. Number two, just today, I read an article that said that the average American knows less about local government and local politics today than ever before in our history.
That doesn't surprise me. I would also add that not everything, in fact, probably most issues are not a binary. So uh, I don't necessarily agree with, well, that's what did it was allowing, and you can do that now, right? And based on how organically objective journalism came into play, presumably and ostensibly, because if I cover both sides, I cover 100% of my audience, I get the bigger share of the audience than if I just pick one side, but that's not what happens. Okay. So human nature has changed. Well, the forums, the platforms, right? Are you familiar? Yeah, yeah. So that goes to how do we get by this? Source information, go read a Supreme Court ruling on your own. Learn, right? Read multiple sources. That's what you're saying. Absolutely, yeah.
There was one more thing about the 1950s other than the fact that they came back from World War II. And that was in the 1950s, there was an implicit social contract. And the implicit social contract was men work outside the home, women stay home. Homosexuality is a psychiatric disease. And there was another one. And then the baby boomers grew up and they said, wait a minute. Some women said, I want to work. I don't want to work in the home. And that too. Yeah, but that's not the point. The point was the implicit social contract of the 1950s.
Well, was it, we can have that's a whole nother topic. All right. So, yeah.
I would just like to add one more. Who remembers? This was something that always stuck with me, where I really kind of got a sense for what journalism, some of the struggles really were about bias or no bias. Is that who remembers the auto dealer Dick Lohr? There was a rumor in Kalamazoo that Dick Lohr and his son, his nickname was Spider, was running a cocaine deal. The newspaper didn't report on it. Jim Mosby, the editor, he was looking into that story. They could not verify it in Kalamazoo or Florida or anywhere, but there was so much pressure. The fact that people were saying, we get it, the newspaper's covering that up because Dick Lohr is one of the biggest advertisers in the newspaper. The one I remember when it came out that Sunday, because Jim Mosby really he was really worked this over. He wrote an article on Sunday saying, we have heard this rumor, but we cannot verify it. And that was one of the most, oh, go ahead.
Remember, his son was found with cocaine in a, I won't discuss it here in public, but his son was found dead with cocaine in part of its body, and we did run that.
All right. Yeah. Very,
I am a Democrat. And so it's unable really to consider the possibility.
okay.
Unable to change their minds.
Yeah. Yeah, they call it, and that goes to Dave's point about consumer bias. Absolutely. That's the hardest thing to do. All right. Have a good summer. And see you all this fall. Oh, please put your name tags back. Don't walk off for the summer with your name tag, or you'll be paying for a new one. Thanks, Jim.